Welcome to Summer Reading Team Episode 2, where we talk about what is influencing education in Iowa. Today we're going to be discussing a paper entitled Developing a Theory of Critical Forgiveness in Educational Leadership by Joanne Marshall and Tyson E.J. Marsh. The abstract for this paper reads as follows. The purpose of this paper is to introduce a theory of critical forgiveness, which we define as a cognitive choice or emotional change towards healing relationships after injustice has occurred, while considering power and privilege of those involved. We suggest that critical forgiveness is especially applicable to research and practice in schools, where relationships are central, and for transformational leadership that seeks to right inequities. Critical forgiveness builds on critical theory and cross-disciplinary research on forgiveness to offer an alternative framework for restoring justice. That restoration is essential for positive relationships in schools, as well as for providing a more equitable learning environment for all students. Several years ago, one of us was facilitating a workshop on spirituality and education and asked the group to consider how their spirituality might influence their practice. Forgiveness was the prompt response from a retired superintendent. Quote, "I had to forgive people in order to move on and work with them," end quote. We agree with the superintendent that forgiveness is an important tool that educational leaders can use, but argue in this conceptual essay that forgiveness also needs a critical lens. And as I was reading this, I thought, well, what doesn't need a critical lens, right? That's what we keep hearing. Everything needs a critical lens. We define critical forgiveness as a cognitive choice or emotional change towards healing relationships after injustice has occurred, and while considering the power and privilege of those involved. We argue that critical forgiveness is essential in schools and for transformative school leaders, both because schools are relational and because they have been and continue to be unjust despite existing justice frameworks such as retributive, restorative, and social justice.
Hold that thought, because you just read something that is repeated continuously throughout this paper. And that is, the leaders must consider the power and privilege. And you go to other pages, it's repeated again. On 253, leaders consider enacting forgiveness while considering power and privilege. On page 252, it says the same thing. Critical forgiveness requires that we acknowledge that the power and privilege involved in these human social constructions, as well as schooling, have their foundations firmly rooted in white supremacy and settler colonialism. Down just a few sentences later, they say again, critical forgiveness requires adherence to consider both power and privilege historically and in the present as they seek to restore relationships. I think the emphasis, just a few sentences later again, it talks about the reproduction of white supremacy and settler colonialism. This all sounds very familiar from critical race theory or critical consciousness, which the Ames School District has been trained in multiple times. Check your power and your privilege.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot too as I went through the paper. It was very repetitive, and you pointed out too, they're always talking about power and privilege, and the critical word, it wouldn't be critical forgiveness if it didn't incorporate critical theory. So that's something that I think we want to impress upon anybody who's listening who's not familiar with a lot of these ideas from critical theory, is that when you talk about critical theory, they're always talking about groups of people, and they're always talking about somebody, one group, not an individual, but one group, and the members of that group having power over a different group. And then when you get into intersectionality, they say, well, you're probably members of multiple groups at once. I'm a straight white male, so there's 3 different groups, and those are all supposedly the power groups in society. So when you hear critical, don't think about critical thinking, because that's not what it is. It's critical Marxism, which is Isaac Gottesman's term. He's a former professor at Iowa State in the School of Education, And he's written extensively about this. So when they say critical forgiveness, it is exactly that.
I got a question. When it says forgiveness, I went up. In order to have forgiveness, there needs to be first a wrongdoing or to have some kind of guilt. So then I looked up, and I'm trying to know what is the precise definition of guilt. Well, guilt. The definition of guilt, evidently, is that there has been a crime, there's been wrongdoing, there's something morally reprehensible. And so then I wondered, are there clearly outlined rules as to what a wrongdoing is in this paper? The way you're talking about it, it sounds like just having power and privilege is a violation of the moral code that it's implicit. They don't explicitly say it, but you're guilty if you have power and privilege. Am I understanding this? Because I just can't figure out what the guilt is a result of what rules have been broken or what morals.
I notice there's a common theme between this podcast and the last one we did, and that they both treat people as members of groups and not as individuals, and they note that any difference between those groups is due to injustice. And that the example of that is the students of color are disproportionately suspended or expelled from school more than white students. Students with disabilities are likely to be suspended more than students without disabilities, and so on. But to me, it seems like they're making it all due to race, and there's other factors that come into play. Those have to be taken into consideration. They say that these are consequences of retributive justice, and they are inequitable.
That actually made me think of something I sat in on for the Ames School District, talking about critical consciousness, and they said explicitly, I think they were very clear, that if you say that there's anything that could be affecting unequal outcomes for students, then you have a deficit mindset. And they explicitly and specifically, I guess they explicitly said that, for example, it's a deficit mindset where people have said before, well, maybe there are more kids of a certain race that have problems at home, and therefore they don't get their homework done, or they don't have parents that help them with their homework, and maybe that could be one factor. That would be a deficit mindset, and you don't want to have a deficit mindset. You want to have a critical consciousness.
The school leader who, I'm quoting from 256, the school leader who wants to practice critical forgiveness in an inequitable retributive justice system, such as one that they've been talking about, can first recognize the ways in which they are transgressor, victim, or both. Once again, that's the key. The leader must, I'm speaking from just the repetitive nature of this paper, that as the leader, what relationship do they have with students? Skip that part. How do suspensions affect other relationships in the community? The paper goes on to talk about, have there been particular discipline policies that have been enacted? Are they enacted with implicit or explicit bias towards students of color, reflecting, for example, a larger societal bias against students of color based on white supremacy and settler colonialism? Third, looking at those terms again, it's all the critical consciousness training that Ames School District has been had put upon them, constantly drumming the same drumbeat of implicit and explicit bias. Educators have bias, and teachers were asked quite often, check your bias. And then just the emphasis on white supremacy. This also was pushed quite often in the school district. This next section, asking what kind of forgiveness? Is it interpersonal or collective? So they go on to emphasize that actually collective critical forgiveness is what they value. And that is, collective is going to the community, going to the groups of people, at the collective level, going to the people in the community who are marginalized and talking with the community about what kind of discipline should they have. I think that that is an interesting way to deal with discipline. And just comparing this to the Ames School District, we do have studies, we do have graphs that show since 2017, when the critical consciousness training was put upon the school district, that there's a direct correlate. There is also, that's the same time that math and reading scores in the district were dropping. And when they're talking about also the suspensions and how to change this, it's interesting that also the statistics show that while math and reading scores were declining, the graduation rate increased. And I'm wondering, is this what collective critical forgiveness is? And is it really helpful for those students?
Well, I think it is the definition of equity, as I understand it, that everybody has the same outcome, so everybody's going to be graduating. But that's a great question. There's a lot of things you could do for a career where you're going to run into reality, and so if you were given a diploma and supposedly could do math, and then you get into a job, can't do the math correctly, that could be a problem. I always like to talk about my father-in-law as a civil engineer, and do you really want somebody who can't get the right answer as far as designing a bridge? Do you really want to drive a vehicle over a bridge and somebody couldn't really get the right answer but was given a diploma anyway? Do you really want to drive over that? I don't. I wanted somebody that can actually design a bridge that will hold the weight that it's supposed to hold. Let's talk a little bit about interpersonal versus collective concepts of forgiveness. That's one of the headings in the paper. One of the parts that I ended up highlighting was that they say Western cultures tend to be more individualistic and conceptualize forgiveness as good for the victims and the perpetrators separately, while collectivist cultures tend to conceptualize forgiveness as beneficial for the common good or for the community rather than beneficial for the individual. Also, they say, like individuals, schools as institutions do not always act justly towards all members of their communities, especially towards people who, because of their lack of power and privilege, are most vulnerable. The forgiveness research thus informs our understanding of what forgiveness is: an active, relational, pro-social choice or change towards individuals or groups. However, it is essential to forgiveness that at the very least the harm stops. Preferably, the perpetrator also acknowledges that harm and seeks to redress it. In the context of schools, where individuals and groups may have been harmed by existing structures that favor white majorities, forgiveness thus also has to include critical questions of who has held and who continues to hold power and privilege, which is why our definition of critical forgiveness includes those considerations. Without critical forgiveness, forgiveness risks replicating and perpetuating harm and injustice that has already occurred. They go on to offer the 5 tenets of critical forgiveness, which if you listen to our first reading team episode, these are going to sound very familiar.
As you were describing that, I was curious, as they talk about forgiveness for harm, does it say anything about what the harm was specifically, or how the harm was committed?
I don't recall anything specific in that. Karen, do you?
They talked about the suspensions being higher for some marginalized communities, but they don't talk about important things, which is learning.
One of the things I notice when I read a lot of these type of papers and books is that the word harm's used a lot, but it's often vaguely defined, and I don't know if maybe it gets penciled in at the time, like this is a harm, and then you didn't know you're doing this harm, and you have to listen to the marginalized person and accept that that is a harm, because we've heard that before too. Like you have to listen to a person from a marginalized standpoint because they have this ability to know things that you don't have. That's the standpoint theory, standpoint epistemology. So this person from a marginalized group then knows that there's harm committed that you as a person with power and privilege don't know and couldn't understand. That's just one idea that I had about that.
What I'm confused about is that the premise of this paper and the movement is about diversity, that people are different, and then there's also the expectation that people are the same and that they should have the same suspension or they should have the same learning rates, and so I feel confused about that. I have asked people that are using this framework to guide the school, administrators, for example. I've said, hey, help me understand this. I have 3 kids. They have the same genetic background. They have the same environment, the same resources. They have access to the same books and technologies, and they don't have the same scores, and they don't get in trouble equally either. We're actually called into the principal's office for one and a little bit for another and never for the other. And so my 3 children are different themselves. And so I guess I'm still trying to grasp and understand what is being suggested is that if there are differences, then someone has been harmed. I'm certainly on board with, if there are differences, can we support those who are behind? Can we, or below benchmark, you might say. I think that schools and parents and teachers, we should all strive to support all kids, and those that are below benchmark as well. But I guess, so again, my question is about the difference, the expectation for both being diverse, but then also being the same. So
the only thing I've been able to figure out with diversity is that the only diversity that this particular viewpoint, worldview, whatever you'd like to call it, is interested in is diversity of intersectional marginalized categories. So we have to hear from people with all these different categories who are all supposed to be the same because of the place that they are occupying, or the place where they've been put in the stratified society.
That was actually my question, was how is harm defined?
I think it's anything that they would describe as an inequity, which is any difference in outcome or any better outcome for the group that they would consider in power. So if you have a better outcome and you're from the group that has power and privilege, then that is harm. Or unequal outcomes in any way across different groups would be considered evidence that harm was done, because that's the only possible reason why you could have a different outcome would be unequal treatment. That's why the new term is opportunity gap. So they don't want to talk about outcome gap. They want to talk about, and it is implied from a difference in outcome that there is a difference in opportunity, and that is not to be questioned, because if you question it, you have a deficit mindset, and you don't want to. Nobody wants to have a deficit mindset, do we? Do you want to have a deficit mindset, Rich? No. Do you, Karen? Do you want to have a deficit? You don't want to have a deficit mindset. Those are bad.
No. When you talk about harm being done, and I'm trying to think, besides talking in depth about suspensions, once a leader examined their privilege and power, it seems to me that the one of the authors of this paper, since they are in the College of Education at Iowa State University, it seems to me that their purpose is to target new teachers. So it seems to me like they are targeting new teachers who they're in class with or teaching to be the future leaders of the schools, and they're telling them that they must check their power and privilege, that many of the historical truths that these new teachers or school leaders have learned, as it says on page 253, are in fact incomplete. They are rife with omissions and deeply damaging to minoritized communities whose lived histories, experiences, and voices have been silenced. That this silencing is perpetuated in systemic ways that school districts are promoting. And I think just also the fourth tenet, they talk about intersectional approach. They're telling leaders once again on page 253 to consider enacting forgiveness while considering power and privilege. They can benefit from engaging in intersectional analysis. But they go on to say that this analysis of intersectional and interlocking systems of oppression can yield opportunities to name and understand structural injustices. Once again, they are simply talking about leaders understanding their power and privilege.
If you listen to our episode 1, these are going to sound familiar, but here are the 5 tenets of critical forgiveness. Reading from the paper, identifying the components required to set the stage for a critical forgiveness framework, we offer the following guiding principles, which have their foundations in critical spirituality, research on decoloniality, and critical race theory. Decoloniality, this is a reference to something called post-colonial theory. The first 2 components of a critical forgiveness framework help leaders prepare to engage in this work, while the remaining 3 components are focused on advancing it. We first identify 1, critical spirituality, as central to our critical forgiveness framework, since implementing this framework requires that we reflect on our own positionality, that's your position in the societal power structures, the stratified society, and work to deconstruct the way in which power moves through us as leaders, so that we may effectively engage the voices and experiential knowledge of minoritized communities. There's the standpoint theory, standpoint epistemology again, for the purpose of transformative action. Connected to this component is a second concept, relationality, as forwarded in the discourse and research on decoloniality. In forwarding these 2 preliminary components, we set the groundwork for engaging in critical forgiveness work in schools. I always think of doing the work. Have you ever heard that phrase? Like they always talk about doing the work. We got to do the work of taking a sledgehammer to the power structures and all that. You heard that?
Do this work. We must do this work.
Yeah, we're doing this work. We're doing the work.
We can do this work.
What's that?
The ICA president.
Oh yeah, right, yeah.
Work to do this.
Was that Becky
work.
Pringle?
Yes.
Yeah.
We get to do this work.
Yeah. There you go.
This work.
This work.
We will do this work.
I'm getting exhausted just thinking about it. Doing all the work.
We must win all the things because our students are depending on us to win all the things. NEA, we have to win all the things, all the things, all the things. Our colleagues are depending on us to win all the things. Keep going, NEA, to preserve our democracy.
So, okay. In forwarding these 2 preliminary concepts, we set the groundwork for engaging in critical forgiveness work in schools, which is informed and connected to three additional concepts: centering the experiential knowledge and voice of minoritized communities, working to understand how intersectional identities can inform understandings of how oppressive structures and functions are experienced across minoritized communities so they may be dismantled, and 5, an emphasis on agency and action and the acknowledgement that as leaders, we have the power and actively make the decision to use this power to disrupt and reinforce the reproduction of colonial relations of power. Below, we offer additional insights into these components central to a critical forgiveness framework.
It just doesn't seem right that you read the 5 tenets of critical forgiveness, and then when you read number 4, one of the tenets of forgiveness is working to understand how intersectional identities can inform understandings of how oppressive structures function and are experienced so they may be dismantled. It really doesn't sound like it's a proper title for this. It's activism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Doesn't sound like forgiveness.
Well, if Becky Pringle gets sick next year for the NEA National Conference, maybe they could have you read it, because that was good. So the reference to critical spirituality is, of course, going to beg the question of what exactly is critical spirituality? Well, it's in the paper, and here's what they say. Spirituality is concerned with, first, matters that transcend oneself, and second, with the ways in which people relate to others. Spirituality is an inclusive term that does not require someone to ascribe to a particular religious affiliation or set of beliefs, though someone could interpret their spirituality through a particular affiliation, as in Buddhist spirituality or Muslim spirituality. However, those religious affiliations themselves can be problematic because of their historical and current roles in colonization and in maintaining white supremacy. Spirituality offers more commonality. It has emerged in education as a holistic way of educating students and viewing one's meaning and purpose. It has been particularly valuable as a source of strength and connection for people who are usually marginalized by the dominant white culture, especially indigenous people, Asian, and African or African American communities. Critical spirituality derives from critical pedagogy. Oh, that's interesting. Which questions the nature of teaching and learning and the underlying power structures that lead to inequity in schools. As defined by Dantley, 2003, critical spirituality is when, quote, the element of critique and deconstruction of undemocratic power relations is blended with the spiritual reflection grounded in an African American sense of moralism, prophetic resistance, and hope, end quote. In practice, it deals with, quote, forthrightly with notions of what is moral, democratic, and equitable in places called schools, end quote. I'm sorry, I couldn't help but laugh at that. In these definitions, spirituality and critical spirituality are both always relational. They concern the individual's relationship with something bigger than oneself, the individual relationships with other people, and individuals' power relations within schools, and with the reproduction of white supremacy and settler colonialism.
There you go again.
Yeah. So Katie Swalwell, it just made me think of it. She always describes herself as a settler, a white settler woman. And that's what she's talking about, is the post-colonial stuff. I also want to, you can't write one of these, I don't think you can get one of these education papers published without citing Freire. I'm pretty sure when they review the papers, after you submit them, they have a flow chart, and like number 1 in the flow chart is, was Paulo Freire cited? And if not, then reject the paper. But they mention him here, and for those who aren't familiar, the biggest thing from Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which was the work that everybody always wants to talk about in this field, he talked about blurring the line between students and teachers, and he preferred educators and learners, and he said the teachers learn from the students and the students learn from the teachers, and the educators are just kind of facilitators. And I always think about that when I hear, like, for example, the National Education Association or the American Federation of Teachers talk about how their members are underpaid. And I thought, well, if you're learning as much from the students as they're learning from you, then why are you paid so much? I thought you were supposed to know more than the people you're teaching. So that always struck me as kind of weird. If you don't know more than the people you're teaching, then, shouldn't the students be paid if they're teaching the teachers? I would think so. Would that be equitable?
And Freire is, Paulo Freire is used in the Ames School District in the critical consciousness training, and he was a Marxist, and to be using his ideas in an educational setting as not just a theory, but more than a theory, something that we should follow. And
almost something that's unquestionably true.
Yes. It in the school district, Ames School District, it was never talked about as a theory, just something that we should, like critical race theory. They never used critical race theory. They used the words critical consciousness, but it was the same thing.
Yeah. So on the next page, too, they talked about Dantley 2003 has drawn upon Cornell West's 1984 work in prophetic spirituality to declare that critical spirituality helps transformative educational leaders to see the reality of what is as well as the possibilities of what could be. Now I think we're getting into a Kamala Harris speech, aren't we?
Yeah, sounds like.
Sounds like it. It does, doesn't it?
That is exactly what is as well as the possibilities of what could be.
What could be?
Same thing.
Did you catch that? Critical spirituality helps transformative educational leaders to see the reality of what is as well as the possibilities of what could be. And you have not apparently been hearing
Something
some
about
of her
being-
speeches.
She gives speeches that sound a lot like the possibilities of what could be and like,
Not being constrained, but
yeah.
by what has been.
Yeah.
You are out of the loop.
I am a little bit. I think Nathan sent me.
I want to add in a couple of things after the discussion. Karen brought my attention to these things, and then it kind of jogged my memory. We mentioned Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, and that might have been the previous podcast, but both Harris and this professor sound the same because they actually both sound the same as Herbert Marcuse, who was very influential in the 1960s. He was part of the Frankfurt School of neo-Marxism. And so I was going to read a couple of segments from a couple of essays that he wrote. The first one is the Essay on Liberation, which he wrote in 1969. Quote, "The liberated consciousness would promote the development of a science and technology free to discover and realize the possibilities of things and men in the protection and gratification of life, playing with the potentialities of form and matter for the attainment of this goal." And another section from earlier in the essay, "Beyond these limits, there is also the space, both physical and mental, for building a realm of freedom which is not that of the present, liberation also from the liberties of exploitative order, a liberation which must precede the construction of a free society, one which necessitates an historical break with the past and the present." And finally, a section from Marcuse's essay of repressive tolerance in 1965. "The author is fully aware that, at present, no power, no authority, no government exists which would translate liberating tolerance into practice, but he believes that it is the task and duty of the intellectual to recall and preserve historical possibilities which seem to have become utopian possibilities. That is his task, to break the concreteness of oppression in order to open the mental space in which the society can be recognized as what it is and does." So those all sound similar because they're talking about the same thing. They believe that they can create a heaven on earth, the utopia, and it requires imagination and breaking with everything that has been, removing the burden of what has been from what can be, or as she said it, what can be unburdened by what has been. Similarly, Scanlon, 2011, found that critical spirituality motivated and committed Catholic school leaders to social justice, as well as helped them cultivate a culture of critical spirituality and inclusivity in their schools. That might be interesting to see what critical consciousness has been trying to be pushed into Catholic schools. Finally, McCrae, Beecham, and Yawn, 2012, proposed that utilizing 4 elements of critical spirituality, critical self-reflection, deconstructive interpretation, that's what I'm going to have to look up, performative creativity, and transformative action could help educators in urban schools, quote, believe that tomorrow will be a better day than yesterday, end quote. In all of these definitions, critical spirituality helps leaders question and determine how their schools might be inequitable so that they can work instead towards equity. We see critical forgiveness as an extension of critical spirituality. While critical spirituality helps leaders develop a transformative and prophetic vision to counter injustices in their schools, critical forgiveness offers a way to be both relationship-focused and equity-focused. It complements transformative leadership, which emphasizes questions of power and privilege while working towards equity by deconstructing unjust systems. Shields, 2011. Critical forgiveness is a way for leaders to conceptualize and cultivate a culture of strong interpersonal and intergroup relationships in schools while constantly questioning existing structures in order to advocate for marginalized students and staff.
Because they are basically just trying to use the idea of critical spirituality to say the same thing. Once again, they say it emphasizes questions of power and privilege while working towards equity, deconstructing existing unjust system. This would be systemic racism. So I don't really, to use the example of the Catholic school leaders, I think it would have, it doesn't mean anything, because really the point they're trying to make is questioning power and privilege. Once again.
No, I was just gonna, there's one other thing I didn't know it was worth making note of. On the page of topic 253, it talks about school leaders must also be conscious of how in their own education many of the historical truths they have learned are in fact incomplete, rife with omissions, and deeply damaging. But that was interesting. So, you know, rewrite history here.
1619 Project, I think, is a great example of what they're talking about here. So they're going to throw in additional stuff and say that your education was whitewashed. That's what they'll say.
Yeah,
there's all this other stuff that you need to know.
Yep.
I like how they cite Zeus Leonardo in here too at the top of page 253. He's I think he's now in charge of School of Education at UC Berkeley. He's the guy that's famous. There's a YouTube video clip of him talking about eliminating whiteness means eliminating white people, or something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, good old Zeus Leonardo.
That reminds me of a quote that the Ames School District in critical consciousness training used by, they used the book by Robin DiAngelo and Shen Soyar, We Really Equal. About one of the earlier pages, she talks about silencing the dominant white voice.
Yep.
It's amazing how influential that book has been too, because it was something that people in media were trying to minimize and say that Robin DiAngelo is just some kooky diversity trainer and she isn't really influential in academia, and it turns out she is extremely influential in academia because we can tell by the citations.
Mm-hmm. She's also become a millionaire peddling her ideas.
I think she was paid something like $20,000 to give a speech at Iowa State. That was maybe in 2018. I'd have to look it up. About that. Okay. The question was about the white.
I was wondering this section about counter storytelling and counter narratives can work to explicate microaggressions and systemic inequities. So that sounds familiar. Where have I heard that?
Pretty sure that's a reference to things like the the 1619 Project. So if you've ever heard the claim that history has been whitewashed, they would say that our history has been taught, or the history that's been taught is the white history. That's the idea that the United States was founded in 1776, and we need the 1619 Project to tell the counter story, which is that it was actually founded in 1619, and that's the black history. That's the unwhitewashed history. That's the real history of the United States, that it is a country that was founded for the explicit and sole purpose of slavery. I've also seen this now described as single stories. There's single stories, and there's second stories that we need to tell too.
Really?
Yeah. And then they'll say things like, they'll pluralize words that don't make any sense to pluralize. Like they'll say histories, and think we have our history. So there's a white history, and there's a black history, and there's a straight history, and a gay history, and all this other stuff. And
Consider enacting forgiveness while considering power and privilege. They can benefit from engaging in intersectional analysis.
You should do a word or a phrase telling that.
She's got a problem.